Judge, it's as if he's running for perhaps a Supreme Court seat that could open at some point.
Yeah, at one point he says that it would have been better to handle this matter with a bipartisan commission in Congress rather than appointing a special. It's like, really? Who asked you?
Well, but the important thing is he ruled in favor of the special prosecutor.
Yes.
That's the important thing. And
unequivocally.
And I think what lawyers will tell you is when they encounter a judge who is clearly leaning against them, it just means they have to be so much better in court. They know that if the ball is on the corner of the plate, the judge is not going to call it a strike. It's just going to always lean one way, and so they just have to be perfect.
And this is a performative judge. We know that everybody says he really likes to show off. He likes to get headlines. He likes to get his name in the paper. He's gotten all this praise from President Trump for previous critical remarks that he made in court against Robert Mueller and the government's case. In this case, though, you're absolutely right. The ruling is squarely against Manafort, squarely for Mueller, but he throws in all these pot shots at Mueller just sort of for effect. It'll be very interesting to see what that means for the next round in this case.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks, Lawrence.
Well, today, a majority of the United States Supreme Court confirmed what they indicated at the end of last year they were very likely to do. In December of last year, the court allowed the third edition of the Trump travel ban to remain in force while the Supreme Court considered the case. Today, in a 5-4 decision, the court said the travel ban is constitutional because it does conform to a law which since 1952 has given every president the broad authority to restrict entry to this country that the president finds, and these are the words of the law, would be detrimental to the interests of the United States. And they leave that finding up to the president. The majority of the court said it didn't matter that the president campaigned on the idea of banning Muslims because the executive order that the White House wrote does not mention religion. The minority on the court believes that the ban is, in effect, a disguised Muslim ban. And we will discuss the law and the politics of that ruling later in this hour. Also today was the day when Trump voters were hit very hard with another shocking disappointment that most of them have not yet heard about because of the news created by the Supreme Court ruling and the crisis at our southern border where the president still hasn't found the babies. And, of course, developments in the special prosecutor's investigation and the endless stream of angry and irrational presidential tweets that happen every day. None of those tweets, though, mention what we learned about the national debt today, which is, of course, skyrocketing to levels only seen during the last World War. And Trump voters don't know that. They have not heard about that today. And so we can add fiscal crisis to the list of crises created by the Trump presidency, but still tonight, none is more pressing, more urgently in need of attention and action, immediate action, than the humanitarian crisis on our southern border. And so we begin once again tonight with the babies. Where are the babies? We still don't know. Where are their parents? The Trump government arrested over 3,000 children and babies at the southern border before the president announced a change in that policy last week. And today, according to Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar, there are still 2,047 migrant children in federal custody after being separated from their parents. Secretary Azar was scheduled to testify at a Senate Finance Committee hearing on the urgent issue of prescription drug prices today, but the top Democrat on the Finance Committee, Ron Wyden, wanted to talk about something even more urgent.
How many have been reunified?
So they would be unified with either parents or other relatives under our policy. So, of course, if the parent remains in detention, unfortunately, under rules that are set by Congress and the courts, they can't be reunified while they're in detention.
So is the answer zero? I mean,
we've had hundreds of children who had been separated who are now with, for instance, if there was another parent who's here in the country.
I want to know about the children in your department's custody. How many of them have been reunified?
Well, that's exactly what I'm saying. They have been placed with a parent or other relative who's here in the United States.
How many?
Several hundred.
Of the
2,300 plus that came into our care,
how many of
2047?
2047. Okay. So that means so far this week, Health and Human Services have helped in some unknown way exactly 6 children. Because Because this weekend, Health and Human Services Department said that they had 2,053 migrant children in custody. This morning, the secretary said they had only 6, less than that, 2,047. Today, 17 states and the District of Columbia asked a federal judge to bar the Trump administration from separating children and their parents who cross the southern border. The Washington Post reports that the state attorneys general are, quote, asserting in a lawsuit that the practice was an affront to states' sovereign interests in enforcing their laws governing minimum standards of care for children. Leading up our discussion now, Jacob Soboroff, MSNBC correspondent, and Hillary Bass, president of the American Bar Association. She observed immigration court proceedings today in McAllen, Texas, and met with parents separated from their children in Port Isabel. Jacob, your assessment of what you heard from the Secretary of Human Services today and what it means about what's going on the southern border.
Well, we don't know, Lawrence, if 6 is actually the right number of children reunited by HHS. We had an absolutely bizarre press conference call with HHS today where Lisa Desjardins from the PBS NewsHour asked repeatedly 3 times in a row of HHS officials, are you still receiving separated kids? And HHS refused 3 times in a row to answer that question. So we don't know if 6 means those are the only number of kids who have been reunited. We don't know if they are actually receiving new children and more children are being reunited than only 6. But Lawrence, I just want to read you something I got in my email 30 seconds before we went on the air. This is new from HHS. They're confirming to me that we receive separated kids when there is credible jeopardy or criminality. So yes, we will still receive separated kids. This is not the circumstance under which the Trump administration was separating children, but HHS has just confirmed to me separated kids are still coming in, which is why there's some confusion with the number of kids they still have in their custody. They say it's 2,047 as of tonight.
So, Jacob, just to clarify, even if the Trump policy has been stopped, even if they've stopped doing that, there would still be, in the normal course of business as there was in the past, some separated children at the border if the parent is found to have a criminal record that indicates that that parent needs to be separated from the child or some other reason.
That's exactly right. And so that's what they are telling me tonight. Another fascinating thing that we heard on this call is that number, 522 kids who have been reunited so far. It was confirmed again to us tonight. That number of children that have been reunited were not actually reunited by HHS. They were reunited by CBP. So that means the number again of children reunited with their parents that were taken away from their parents by this policy may be only a handful by HHS. They may not have reunited any, as far as we know, until we get this number sorted out with the children that are still being separated coming in versus the children that are going out. Still so many questions that they haven't answered.
And Hillary Bass, reunited is being used now, but it doesn't necessarily mean reunited with a parent. In some cases, they're talking about having these children go to some other relative in the United States.
That's correct, Lawrence. And we also spoke to a number of women today who indicated that they had provided information about sponsors in the U.S. for their separated children. One had a husband who was documented and lived in the United States, and she indicated from the first day that she was brought into detention, she informed them that she had a husband in the United States and that her children should be given to the husband. And yet, despite that, after 4 weeks of being in detention, there's been no effort to reunite the children with their father. So there are all kinds of stories that we heard today that really reflect the lack of transparency in this process. These women who are in detention, many of them have not heard from their children. They don't know where their children are, and no one is telling them what the process will be to allow them to be reunified. Some went so far as to tell us, we know we have legitimate asylum claims. We would give it all up if you will just return us to our children. And that's a scary thought, because that would seem to indicate that people with legitimate bases to be in the United States legally are going to give up those rights just to be prevented, just so that they can be back with their children.
We have a graphic on the bottom of the screen, HHS 2,047 separated children still in custody. I would respectfully submit it should say HHS says 2,047 separated children still in custody, because Hillary Bass, we don't know. As Jacob Soboroff just said, we can't trust the numbers coming out. We can report what they say and attribute to them that they have said it. But Hillary Bass, how will we, is there a legal way? Do lawyers have a strategy for trying to amass case data from around the country and figure out an independent source of real numbers?
Well, as I told these sobbing women today, American lawyers will not rest until every one of them is reunified with their children. And so we are seeking volunteer attorneys, both to represent the parents in South Texas as well as the children in whatever city in the United States they are, to evaluate their legal claims and to ensure that there is someone who will be their advocate, to do everything possible to ensure that they will be reunified with their parents.
What did you see in immigration court today? Does it look like a changed policy is in place?
Immigration court, there were 75 people, each of which got to spend about 2 minutes with the public defender to tell them the rights they were waiving by virtue of going through this criminal process and admitting guilt for having illegally crossed the border. But mind you, this is a direct result of a zero-tolerance policy. Previously, many of these people would have been immediately deported if they didn't have a basis for an asylum claim without going through this kangaroo court of 75 people walking in and raising their right hand and all saying, yes, they were guilty of illegally crossing the border.
Jacob,
it didn't accomplish anything.
Jacob, do we have a total? Do we have a real total number? Because the media has been using this number, 2,000, low end of the 2,000s. That was a June 9th number. And the policy went on for another 2 weeks after that. Have the federal government ever released a total number of children who they separated?
No, and actually, Lawrence, it's not just on the back end, it's on the front end as well. You know, we have been told that policy, before it was announced, was sort of unofficially in place. Parents were getting separated from their children for the simple act of the misdemeanor of crossing over the border before the official policy actually was enacted. And I just want to say something about what you said earlier about independent verification. I spent the day I'm back in Los Angeles. I spent the day on the phone here with immigrants' rights groups on the ground. I think the biggest Central American population in the country, if I'm not mistaken, is here in Los Angeles. And those groups are not able to independently verify the numbers of separated children that are on the ground in ORR facilities here, even the ones that have their numbers on the wall in those facilities, in order for those immigrants to be able to make a call to those groups if they need them. That is all still being worked out here on the back end by the groups that are supposed to be the ones looking out for these folks.
And Hillary Bass, at what point might these parents lose their parental rights and lose their children to an adoption process that they cannot control?
The big concern is that these parents get deported while their children are in some distant city. And since we have reason to believe that these records are not accurate, some of those children may have been identified as unaccompanied when in fact they were accompanied with a parent, but they were separated at the border. And it's unclear that any of the documentation that the government bureaucracies currently have is accurate in really telling us which parent goes with which child.
And Jacob, when I was in Texas, I saw a sheet handed out by local community organizers who were trying to track this. And the sheet indicated the kind of children who they believe were held at various facilities, the name of the facility, and it would say boys, ages 12 to 17, something like that, or girls. Has the government handed out any official document of that kind and indicated where it, within that kind of outline, where babies, infant babies and nursing babies are?
No, absolutely not. And in fact, the only way, or one of the only ways we're able to try to suss out where folks are, who they are, and how old they are is through the local jurisdictions responsible for licensing these operations. And just like the Texas Department of Public Health, had issued the license to operate Casa Padre, the giant shelter that I went into that was in a former Walmart with 1,500 boys. For instance, if there is one of those shelters or more of them here in the city or the county of Los Angeles, the county or the city health department or some other department would have to license those facilities to operate. So if you really want to figure it out, you basically have to call up all of these local jurisdictions, see what these facilities are licensed for, and then dig deeper based on, that limited information we're able to get at this point.
Well, some observers told me at Casa Presidente, for example, in Bronzeville, that they saw diapers. They saw a large delivery of diapers going in, and they believed that they saw soiled diapers coming out. And that's the kind of evidence they're working with down there, trying to piece this together. Jacob Soboroff, Hillary Bass, thank you both very much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Lawrence.
Coming up, the Trump tax cuts aren't just unpopular, they are pushing the country toward bankruptcy. The biggest story that Donald Trump does not want you to hear tonight is what Donald Trump has done to the national debt. And we will have some breaking news tonight in primary elections. Steve Kornacki will join us. Okay, we are about to talk about the most important story of the day that Donald Trump doesn't want us to talk about. Now, every day there are stories that Donald Trump doesn't want us to talk about, and he's lucky because we often don't get to many of those stories, like, for example, the rampant corruption in his cabinet from Scott Pruitt to Wilbur Ross. But tonight, there is one story above all others that is by far the most important story that Donald Trump doesn't want us to talk about, the biggest story. Remember the $19 trillion?
We have $19 trillion in debt going very soon to $21 trillion because we made a bad budget deal. Now we're going to have $21 trillion in debt. We don't have any money. We have got a mess in this country. We owe $19 trillion, soon to be $21 trillion. We have right now $19 trillion in debt. So I built this some of the great assets, low debt, great cash flow, and I say it for a different reason, because that's the kind of thinking we need in our country now, or we're not going to have a country left. We're not going to have, literally, we're not going to have a country left.
I thought we weren't going to have a country left if we didn't arrest enough babies at the southern borders. But okay, so we're not going to have a country left because of the national debt. And so tonight, Donald Trump has done everything he can to make sure that, as he puts it, we are not going to have a country left because, as president, he has pushed us up to that $21 trillion in national debt, and he is now on track to reach new record debt levels way, way, way above that. The latest Congressional Budget Office projections of the debt made public today for the first time show that during the Trump administration, the debt will dramatically increase every day, every week, every year, with no end in sight. The Trump tax cuts have significantly accelerated what is now Donald Trump's rush to a fiscal crisis much worse than anything he encountered in his Atlantic City casino bankruptcies. The Trump tariffs are doing their part too. They are already costing jobs in the United States, even though Donald Trump believed that the tariffs would save jobs. The Trump tariffs have actually created an incentive for American manufacturers like Harley-Davidson to move production to foreign countries because the European Union has announced retaliatory tariffs against the Trump tariffs on products sold in Europe that are made in the USA. No surprise that they were going to do that. And so Harley-Davidson, quite logically, cannot continue to sell Harley-Davidsons made in the USA in Europe, thanks to Donald Trump, so they will make them in some other country and then sell them in Europe. The Trump response to that, of course, is a series of angry and utterly incoherent and economically illiterate tweets. The Harley-Davidson story has been a bad one for President Trump, but at least no one's talking about the national debt. Joining us now to talk about the national debt, Ron Klain, the former chief of staff to Vice Presidents Joe Biden and Al Gore, a former senior aide to President Obama. Also joining the discussion, David Corn, Washington bureau chief for Mother Jones, and the co-author of the best-selling book, Russian Roulette. He's also an MSNBC political analyst. And Ron, it's not easy every day to try to pick what's the biggest story that Donald Trump doesn't want us to talk about. But the national debt is it, and it is going to be fascinating to try to see how the Republican Party turns around, as it has on Russia and so many things, and decides that debt is good. A higher and higher national debt is a good thing, because that seems to be the only way for Donald Trump to address it, because there's nothing they're going to do to bring it down.
Yeah, I mean, they're not only not going to bring it down, as you said, Lawrence, they're skyrocketing it up. I mean, this is a story of a promise broken and an odd promise kept. The promise broken was Trump promised he would get rid of all the national debt, total, wipe it all out while he was president. Instead, he's going to raise it to a record level. That's a big promise broken. The promise he's kept is he said his deficit would be nowhere near Obama's deficit of $400 billion. Well, he's kept that promise. They're going to run $1 trillion deficit this year. That's nowhere near what Obama did in his last year. And so I agree, they're going to have to turn and run. But in the end, right, the bill will come due. And the horrible thing about this is just last week, the House of Representatives, the Republican House, passed a so-called farm bill that cut food stamps, because we don't have enough money to put food on the table of the people in this country who lack it. But we had $1 trillion for tax cuts that are running up the federal debt. That's just a horrible set of choices.
And David, the largest foreign holder of our national debt, which you can hold simply by buying treasury bonds, is, of course, China. So as this debt goes up, as it becomes more burdensome here in the United States, China gains more and more leverage and control over the president.
This is Donald Trump's big con. You played it over and over again. He made a promise, and he caught the headlines. He will get rid of the debt and have smaller deficits. Well, you know, the bill will come due. But the thing, we're living in a time now where there will be no acknowledgement of that. Trump will never acknowledge the real numbers. The Republicans will never acknowledge the real numbers. Where are the Bob Dylans of the world? They've gone away. No Republican cares about the deficit anymore. And even now, the House Republicans have said that come the fall, they are going to pass, or try to pass, another tax bill that would make permanent some of the tax cuts in the previous tax bill, and that would even explode the deficit and the debt much more than in the numbers that came out today. So they are not doing anything except complaining about spending, because that's the whole goal here. They're going to use this debt to say, well, we can't spend money on the food stamps that you just mentioned. We're going to have to squeeze Medicare and Social Security because we're going to have to be paying for servicing the debt.
And anyone up there who's had credit card debt, or this actually behaves like credit card debt. It's the most expensive kind of debt you can encounter, because as this debt goes up, the interest on the debt goes up dramatically. And Ron, that interest on the debt eats up in the budget every year. No one mentions it, but it is one of the largest pieces of the budget, getting bigger and bigger every year. And it's on track to become the largest spending item in the budget, dwarfing all of the discretionary spending in the budget. And what that means is it wipes out that spending on education, on all sorts of problems, all sorts of issues out there that all have to go into basically zero spending modes just in order to pay your debt.
Yeah, it seems like Trump is running a contest between, trying to run up the Pentagon budget and run up the debt to see which number can be larger in our budget, interest payments on the debt or increasingly large payments to the Pentagon. But look, Lawrence, I think the scariest thing of all is, we're seeing these kinds of numbers at a time of relative prosperity. Sooner or later, the business cycle will turn. And if Trump keeps pressing these tariffs, it'll turn sooner rather than later. And that means means that the deficit will just explode even more. We'll see the Trump recession. It will come, and then these numbers will look worse and worse and worse, and the government will be out of dry fiscal powder to try to stimulate the economy or do something about it. So tonight's news is bad, but the future news is even worse.
And it's a very difficult subject to run campaigns on because the public does not easily grasp it, and it doesn't have any of the excitement of some of the other things that come out in the course of a day, especially the stream of Trump tweets. We're going to have to, David, sorry, we're going to have to leave it there for now. We're going to have to go to some breaking news that we have on the campaign trails tonight in the primaries. David Corn, Ron Klain, thanks for joining us. We have primaries around the country. We have a Supreme Court case of some real import to consider when we come back. But the Utah primary has just been called. It's an important primary. Steve Kornacki is going to join us now. Steve, what do you have on it?
That's right, Lawrence. It's official, if not surprising. Mitt Romney, the 2012 Republican nominee for president, making his political comeback. He has won the Republican nomination for the U.S. Senate in Utah, defeating his opponent, Mike Kennedy. This makes Romney immediately the prohibitive favorite to win this seat. Utah State, of course, that he won by 50 points in 2012, setting up that scenario next January of a Senator Romney and a President Trump in that dynamic. So this result now official. If this one wasn't unexpected, there was another shocker we'll tell you about in a little bit here in the other party as well. A very busy night all of a sudden, Lawrence.
Steve, quickly, before we take a break here, Mitt Romney's been on a tightrope in this campaign. He has a history of saying some very harsh things, accurate things about Donald Trump, and yet he's running within a party that supports Donald Trump. And so during the primary, he's had to be kind of careful. Does this win tonight liberate Mitt Romney to say what he really thinks about Donald Trump?
It's interesting, potentially, and the other element with Utah, don't forget, we say Republican state. As red states go, this one did not like Donald Trump. When Donald Trump ran in the Republican primaries, he got 13% in Utah. Remember, Ted Cruz beat him by more than 50 points. In the general election, Evan McMullen, that third-party candidate who ran as sort of a non-Trump guy, got 25% of the vote in Utah. So this is still a very conservative state. There are a lot of Republicans who do not like Trump. If there is one red state in the country where it is politically safe for a Republican office holder to come out and express some problems with Donald Trump, it's Utah.
All right, Steve, we're coming back to you after a break. When we come back, we're going to have more from Steve Kornacki and more about that Supreme Court decision today. We'll be right back. It is primary night in 7 states, including New York State, where we have breaking news. Democratic Congressman Joe Crowley, who is the chairman of the House Democratic Caucus, has lost the primary to 28-year-old activist Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who has never held elective office. Steve Kornacki joins us now with this breaking news. Steve, this is a big upset.
Lawrence, this one is truly shocking. When you say Crowley, the chair of the House Democratic Caucus, Crowley, a 20-year veteran of Congress, Crowley was thought to be the next Democratic leader. If and when Nancy Pelosi steps down, Crowley was thought to be the guy who had the votes, who had the relationships, who was in position to replace her. And now, just like that, in his home district in Queens, in a little piece of the Bronx here in New York, he has been defeated soundly in this primary tonight, as you say, by a 28-year-old upstart, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. To tell you a little bit about her, she was a supporter of Bernie Sanders. She is a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. She campaigned in particular on an issue we've been talking about a lot over the last week, the issue of immigration, the issue of how to handle the situation at the border. She wants to abolish ICE. That is an issue on the left side of the party that may be getting some traction. A victory like this for her tonight will probably hasten that issue making its way into the conversation a bit. So Crowley, again, was thought to be maybe next year the leader of the Democrats in Congress, maybe a Speaker of the House. He goes down in his home district. Absolutely shocking upset here. Nearly, by the way, a second upset. Yvette Clarke is a 12-year incumbent here in New York. She is barely hanging on. This race has not been called. She does have the lead right now, but she's barely hanging on. That would be 2 Democratic incumbents going down, though, again, the scale there wouldn't be quite as much. We can tell you as well, we thought this was going to be the biggest story tonight. Michael Grimm, the ex-con, ex-congressman, trying to win back his seat against Dan Donovan, Republican there on Staten Island. Actually, Donovan ended up winning this thing soundly tonight. Grimm will not be going back to Congress. That turns out not to be the big story. It really is, Lawrence. This is going to be talked about for a long time, about the future of the Democratic Party. Joe Crowley, not just a long-serving congressman, he was a party boss in the old sense, the chair of the Queens County Democratic Committee. He had never faced, when he got this seat 20 years ago, didn't even have to have an open primary. There was a backroom maneuver that put him on the ballot. He was the party boss. He got reelected. And look at this. He gets opposition here. There's low turnout. There's energy on this side. And that is it for Joe Crowley.
Steve, I have to say, having been around New York politics a long time, I am not at all surprised that somebody who has actually never faced a challenge, if you don't have a Democratic primary in that district, you don't have a challenge. There's no Republican is going to even bother to show up on the ballot in November. And so Joe Crowley never faced a challenge. He was never actually tested at the ballot box. And you have a shifting demographic in a district that includes the Queens and Bronx. This is old ethnic politics. The Irish were on their way to giving up that seat, and they gave it up tonight. I don't think they're going to be getting it back.
You know, this is the district where the show All in the Family was set. All those This was Archie Bunker's district. It is now 75% non-white. There's that changing demographics in this area, changing demographics in the party, changing demographics in the country. That's a big part of this story. And you mentioned the lack of competence. The famous line for Joe Crowley in New York politics, political folks nationally remember this. When he got the seat 20 years ago, it was his mentor, who was the former congressman who retired after the deadline, got the party committee to put Crowley on the ballot with no primary, and they asked Crowley, the reporters came to him and they said, you know, is that the right way to really do this? Shouldn't you have the election? He said, you know what? They offered me an ice cream cone and I took it.
That's the way they used to do it, but you can't do it that way anymore, and the demographic change in that district is what you're seeing, I think, in that vote tonight. Steve Kornacki, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate that. When we come back, today's Supreme Court ruling is yet another lesson in how Republican voters have been focusing so intently. We have more in our breaking news in the New York State primary election tonight. Congressman Joe Crowley has lost his seat in Congress tonight in New York City, in Queens and the Bronx, and he has now immediately endorsed Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the 28-year-old activist who defeated the incumbent Democrat tonight in the primary, a very, very low turnout primary here in New York City, 57% to 42%. Congressman Crowley just tweeted, "I want to congratulate Ocasio 2018. I look forward to supporting her and all Democrats this November. The Trump administration is a threat to everything we stand for here in Queens and the Bronx. And if we don't win back the House this November, we will lose the nation we love." Joining us now with this part of our discussion, Maya Wiley, former counsel to the mayor of New York City. Also with us, Eugene Robinson, opinion writer for the Washington Post and an MSNBC political analyst. Maya, you know these congressional districts here in this city. I have to say, this doesn't strike me as that big a surprise that the demographic change eventually caught up with the representation.
I think that's right. If you watched Ocasio's, she actually had the most impressive video. And in her video piece introducing herself to the district and really to all of New York, because many of us watched it, even if we weren't in her district, she starts it by saying, women like me aren't supposed to run for office. And then she talks about zip codes being determinative of what your opportunities are. She talked about her personal life story of having a Puerto Rican mother and a father from the South Bronx. I mean, she was clearly signaling in that video that she was representing what that district really is now. And she also said very explicitly in that video, who is this New York changing for? So she had these very clear messages that were really about whether or not the city and Joe Crowley, by extension, was actually serving the population that really is representative of that district now.
And Gene, Joe Crowley had the kinds of problems that people who've hung around these offices for too long sometimes pick up. Stories about relative who's a lobbyist and perhaps gaining some benefits in his lobbying activity because of that. And whenever you have a fresh incumbent, a fresh challenger to an incumbent who hasn't had to even get in the boxing ring in a couple of decades, it's always ripe for an upset.
Right. You know, it has to be sort of a perfect storm, and it was. I mean, and obviously one element of this has to be that Crowley didn't pay enough attention to this race. But nonetheless, you know, he raised a lot of money, and he certainly outraised and outspent Ocasio-Cortez. And look, she talked about issues that resonated with the voters of that district, or certainly with those who bothered to vote. She talked about universal health care. She talked about abolishing ICE. She talked about the crushing Puerto Rican debt. You know, in a district that is now about 50% Hispanic, and otherwise incredibly diverse. Those are issues that resonated, and Joe Crowley didn't, frankly, connect with voters the way she did, and I think that's a healthy thing for the Democratic Party. You know, it's a kind of renewal.
It feels inevitable if you've been watching New York City politics for a while. Maya Wiley, Gene Robinson, thanks for joining us in this discussion. When we come back, the Supreme Court decision that has allowed the president to continue his travel ban.